Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and this video is my Terminator retrospective. Been a long time coming. So, obviously I'm not just going to talk about the 1984 original movie, The Terminator, the techno thriller, not horror movie. Get that out the gate. But I'm talking about that film as well as subsequent films and my experiences with the franchise. Two, spin-offs and associated media, video games, comic books, assorted other stuffs, toys possibly. And so we'll start with my an personal account of my experience with the Terminator franchise. I, honest to God, cannot tell you how old I was the first time I watched Terminator, because I know we had it on VHS and we got our VCR in 1988. And I was born in 82, so I would have been at the minimum 6 years old the first time I watched it. But I remember watching it all the time as a kid. So I can't pinpoint the exact first time I watched it or what my first impressions were, because it was likely one of those movies I just watched so much. So often that it's just ingrained in my brain. So there is that. However, I can tell you with fair degree of certainty where I was and what I was doing the first time I watched Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Because I was, I believe, 9 years old when that one came out, and I would have watched it on, I remember renting it on VHS, not the first week it was available on VHS, but pretty close to the first month it was available, because it was one that we were, as a family, me and my parents and sisters and uncles and everybody were looking forward to seeing. So I can say with a fair degree of certainty we watched it. Let's see, it came out in 91. We most likely watched it in 92. I would have been 10 years old. And I had already seen The Terminator at least a couple dozen times by that point. I do remember a couple of things that stand out in my mind the first time I watched Terminator 2. First, way more action than the first movie. Second, way more emphasis on technology than the first movie. You know, computers and hacking and weapon systems and computer programming and all that, computer models and that stuff. And three, the CGI, because CGI was still fairly new in Hollywood at this time. And while it is incredibly dated by today's standards, was fucking mind-blowing in 91 when that movie came out. Having been obsessed with robots and computers and science and sci-fi tech, I would develop an affinity, because I was also really obsessed with video games, and the evolution of video games in the 90s was going from 2D graphics, you know, sprite-based, tile-based graphics, to 3D polygonal-based graphics, and eventually CGI. So I developed an appreciation for CGI early on. So this movie had a tremendous impact on me as a person, on my interests and everything else. I do remember the first time I watched Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. I rented it again on VHS. Fairly soon after it came out, was released on VHS. I didn't see it in theaters. Not for lack of want. It was just there were so many movies at that time that I wanted to see in theaters. I couldn't see them all. And I was blown away by Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. I remember thinking that it took the story in the direction I personally wanted it to as a fan. I was like, okay, this is where we're going. I like this. Those first 3 Terminator movies, to me, make up the trilogy. And here's where I'm going to lose some of y'all. When I watched Terminator Salvation, first time I watched it, I turned it off. I didn't even finish it. I was like, nope, this is fucking dumb. I couldn't even finish it. It was too fucking dumb. But I was like, you know what? Alright, calm down. I've got issues with it. Oh boy, howdy, do I have issues with it. But I'll suppress those and try to give it a fair shake so I can at least say I watched the whole fucking movie. Which I did. And by the end of it, I was wishing I had just stopped the first time I turned it off and left it there, because god damn, that movie sucked. This is where I'm going to lose everybody else that I haven't lost yet. That movie was so goddamn awful that I have intentionally refused to watch anything else Terminator related since then. I did not see the Sarah Connor Chronicles. Won't watch it. I did not see Genesis, or what is it, Dark Fate, or whatever the fuck it's called. The animated show that Netflix is getting ready to... None of it. I'm just... As far as I'm concerned, it's a trilogy. And, yeah, I'm 42 years old, y'all. Well, 41. About to be 42. I'm set in my ways, you know? I don't need any more... I'm good. I got my Terminator. I got the trilogy. Y'all can have it. It's your franchise now. I don't fucking want it. However, I have to backpedal one more time. Because Terminator came out in 84. Now, it did not get, to the best of my knowledge, contemporary video games the year it came out. No arcade games, to my knowledge. No home console or home computer games. It took a couple of years before it started to get video game adaptations, and those were turning up on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Again, I was renting from local video stores. So I started playing Terminator video games. And then I discovered T2, the arcade game, in the arcade at the time, and would eventually pick up both home ports, the Sega Genesis version and the Super NES version, because I had both consoles at different times in my life. And I had a lot of fun playing that game. There were there was like RoboCop versus Terminator, which we're going to sweep under the rug. And then there was the one on the Sega CD that I had no access to because I didn't have a Sega CD. But to the best of my knowledge, as far as Terminator goes, that was it for video games until there was like a movie adaptation of Rise of the Machines turned into a video game. And that's basically, as far as I know, it. I haven't kept up with the franchise, like I said, because Salvation was so god-awful that I just lost interest in the franchise entirely. So that's my personal account of my experiences with the Terminator. So now let's backpedal one more time and just kind of do a gloss over the franchise as a whole. We're going to skip over the messy bits. We don't need to get into it. We're just going to talk about the movies. We don't need to get into the controversies, the behind-the-scenes shenanigans. None of that. Terminator came out in 1984. Big hit. James Cameron put his name on the map. Nothing with the franchise aside from a couple of home video games on the Nintendo the rest of the decade. And then at the beginning of the 90s, we got Terminator 2, Judgment Day. Big hit, big, massive blockbuster, big budget movie, groundbreaking special effects for the time, etc., etc. Yeah, some weird stuff happened behind the scenes, and we would go more than a decade before we would get Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. Now, Terminator 3 was mostly financially successful, and believe it or not, pretty well received with critics at the time. Obviously, things have gone, there's some retconning going on, but at the time, in general, it received pretty favorable responses from most people. There were the common criticisms of, well, James Cameron wasn't involved, etc., etc. But as a whole, most people at the time enjoyed it. But then people quickly turned on it. And then when Salvation came out, which came out a year or two later, people did what I did. They just dropped the franchise like a bad habit. They were like, nope, I'm tapping out. So it would be a few years before we would get anything else Terminator. Well, we got the TV series, but that, as far as I'm concerned, never happened. It'd be a few years before we would get the next movie, which was kinda, sort of, a reboot. And then a few more years would go by, and then we would get another kinda, sort of reboot. And like I said, I have not seen Genesis or Dark Fate. I just know of them, and I've seen the ending of Genesis because I, knocked on the door at my sister's house one day, and she invited me in, and they were watching it, and it was the end of the movie, so I sat down and watched the end of the movie, because I wasn't going to say, hey, I'll just sit out on the porch until the movie's done. So, I at least have a marginal understanding of what took place in that movie, which reinforces my desire to not fucking see it. Because what I did see, I was like, no thank you. Now, Terminator, you might not know this, was actually remade once before. In 1999, with Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne. It was called The Matrix. And yes, I remember the very first time I watched The Matrix, I turned to my best friend I was watching it with, and I said, isn't this the Terminator? And my friend said, yeah, this is the fucking Terminator. Now, fortunately, superficial similarities was as far as that went, and then it went in a whole nother direction. But up to that point, it felt like, yeah, this is just the fucking Terminator. So, yeah, spoilers. Anyways, I didn't really talk about comic books. I briefly touched on video games. And remember when I said we're going to sweep RoboCop versus the Terminator under the rug? That's because I'm going to do a whole separate retrospective on RoboCop versus the Terminator. So, put a pin in it. We'll come back to it. 2 questions. Well, 3 questions. Question 1, what was the first Terminator you saw, and how old were you when you saw it? Question 2, which is your favorite Terminator? And question 3, what are your experiences outside the movies? Comic books, video games, toys, etc. Stay cool.